Start with homage to the triple gem. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So there's a sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya, the numbered discourses, called the Anuruddha Sutta. And it's the description of Venerable Anuruddha, who was one of the disciples of the Buddha, who was known for his ability with the divine eye. And in this he's meditating and thinking about the great thoughts of a noble being. So, reflecting to himself, he thinks this Dhamma is for one who is content, not discontent, who is modest, not self-aggrandizing, who is reclusive, not entangled, who has their energy aroused, not for one who is lazy. This Dhamma is for one who is mindful, not for one who is muddle-minded, for one who is concentrated, not who is unconcentrated, for one who has wisdom, not for one who lacks wisdom. And then the Buddha, having discerned this train of thought, manifests in front of Venerable Anuruddha in this sutta, which would be quite surprising if you lived at the time, and says, "Good, good, Venerable Anuruddha. These are indeed the great thoughts of a great being. But there is one more. This Dhamma is for one who is, the word is nipapancha, non-proliferation. This Dhamma is for one who delights in non-proliferation, not for one who delights in proliferation." So these 8 points, these thoughts which make us into, in a sense, a vessel for the Dhamma, for this teaching, and for the purpose and duty and well-being which it entails and brings, are important to pay attention to. And each is seemingly simple enough, but the Buddha goes on to expand in detail on every point. So he begins by speaking to the first great thought, which is this Dhamma is for one who is modest, not for one who is self-aggrandizing or one of few wishes. And the description in the sutta is, there's the case where a bhikkhu, which is the word for, has the connotation of any practitioner listening at the time. Does bhikkhu, being modest, does not want it known, I am modest. Being content does not want it known, I am content. Being reclusive does not want it known, I am reclusive, and so on. And this aspect of humility, the Pali word is apichayata, which can either mean one of few wishes or one who wishes to be small. compound is made of the word for small and then wishes, so they can sort of apply to each other in different ways. And this is a somewhat foreign concept in the West, where the concept of humility and true humility is something we speak to, but seeing it embodied truly is a real blessing. And it reminds me of one of the most beautiful stories in our tradition, which is of the teacher of Ajahn Mun, who was the grandfather of this lineage, who lived in the early part of the 1900s. And when the institution of monasticism in Thailand had dismissed enlightenment and the complete purification of the heart as impossible in this day and age, Ajahn Mun went off into the forest, wandering for years through the jungle, and by all accounts, returned with blistered feet and encounter with awakening. And it was Ajahn Mun who ushered into being the spring of faith in Thailand, in whose summer we now find ourselves. And hundreds of teachers came from his teaching, including Ajahn Chah. So Ajahn Sao was his teacher and got him on the path. And then after Ajahn Mun encountered the fruits of the path, he went back and taught Ajahn Sao. And the end of Ajahn Sao's life, he was in a boat traveling along the Mekong River in Isan, which is the hardy northeast area of Thailand during the French bombings in the middle of the century. And he and the boat went into Laos, where he was stung by a huge number of hornets, which in Thailand are extremely poisonous. And he got very ill, and they finally arrived after 3 days at a small village named Basak. And he sort of looked up from the boat and asked if they were there, and they said yes, and he walked into the temple of the village and bowed 3 times, and then on the 3rd bow, he didn't rise. So what does it mean to have humility and such devotion to a path that our lives and even our passing can be infused with a beauty and a purpose of that magnitude? And this, I believe, is one of the secrets hidden in the humility of the Dhamma, in that as long as our sense of trajectory and purpose in the world comes from only ourselves, then we have, in a sense, no choice but to be somewhat egotistical, because our purpose, our views, our self is what orients us. Only when we give up and surrender to something larger can we put that aside. Ajahn Sucitto has spoken about the 3 fetters, which are these bonds of the heart that are abandoned at stream entry, or the first encounter with awakening. And these 3 are self-view, doubt, and attachment to rites and rituals. And what he notes is that only when doubt is gotten rid of can the attachment to the self also be ameliorated. Because only when we begin to have faith, not in some blind sense, but rather an intuitive sense deep in our generally hearts, and usually this small voice of the Dhamma manifests in the torso, can we suddenly have something guiding us that is not ourself and our views. And then, and only then, can we release our white-knuckled grip on that constellation of self. And this is the value of a daily practice. And I know a Catholic nun who I once asked what had kept her in robes all these years, and she said that after a time, the voice of God becomes the most important thing. And I believe that this thing she was speaking to is that small voice of the Dhamma that does speak to us. And while sometimes it speaks loudly, so often it's a quiet nudge. And unless we have a space in our lives where it has room to manifest and guide us, then there's no way of hearing it. And our lives slowly wander off course. This is also the beauty of breath meditation, is the ability to drop the awareness from the head into the heart, where this voice lives, in a sense, is essential if one is to gain intuitive contact with it. Ajahn Sumedho speaks of it as the intuitive awareness in one. So when this is our guide, then we no longer have to take our views as a guide, and we can become humble in the truest sense of the word. And there's a great teacher who says that as long as bowing is in the world, Buddhism will be in the world. As soon as bowing disappears, then Buddhism will have disappeared. And it's significant that even when the Buddha had attained enlightenment, he thought, now that I have no teacher, who do I bow to? Who do I take as my teacher? And he thought the Dhamma is who I take. Venerable Ananda, when asked who would lead the community after the Buddha had passed, said that it is not the noble ones that make us act. It is the Dhamma that makes us act. And we all worship something. So how do we elevate what is worthy of worship? Creating a shrine in our rooms, or some ritual every day where we remember what is our Polaris in life. And this humility that you find manifests in really beautiful ways. Ajahn Jayasaro, who I had the pleasure of living with for a time, is, I think at this point, the most famous monk in Thailand. He gives talks regularly at the Royal Palace and is extremely well known. He's from England. And he would, though, despite that, even now, at the age of 55 or so, go off to India. And several years ago, this was his present to himself for his 50th birthday, was to go to India and wander alone for, I think, a month through the Indian countryside, as is our tradition, not being able to use money, relying completely on the faith, and unknown to anyone. The great teachers of every tradition have done this. Shu Yun was known for living in a cowshed outside of the monastery he was abbot of, and he would refuse to move in, despite the fact that everyone invited him to constantly. So I think it was a pigsty. The next value is, or the next thought of a great being, is this Dhamma is for one who is content, not for one who is discontent. In the suttas, the Buddha speaks of mudita, sympathetic joy, as the cure for discontent. And Ajahn Jayasaro has actually spoken to this too, saying that a good measure of our practice is how sensitive we become to the acts of goodness we see. He speaks about, before he ordained, traveling through Iran. He traveled for a year or so with no money on faith. And he'd lost his passport and ended up, I think, in Israel. And a woman found him disheveled. I think he'd just made his way through Afghanistan, in a truck, slept rolled up in a rug after almost being like robbed. Not that he had anything to rob, but a woman randomly came across him on the street wandering without passport or any money, and without saying a word, she ushered him up into her apartment, fed him, clothed him, let him take a shower, and then sent him back onto the road. And he was so touched. And his reflection on this later was that it was the first time he'd realized what gratitude he should have truly for his parents, because this is something they had done for him every single day, and he never thought of it. And this speaks to the goodness that holds our lives together and that we so easily miss. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha says that suffering follows the untrained mind like the wheel of a cart, the hoof of an ox, whereas happiness follows the well-trained mind like a shadow that never leaves. And as with most of the Buddha's analogies, there's so much hidden here. In that suffering, the ox cart's wheel is easily seen. It's coarse. We see and notice our suffering. We remember the headlines. We remember what the latest political party of the opposite side did. And we forget the shadow, which is so easily missed. We forget the happiness and the brightness that surrounds us and holds our lives together. We forget the great gift that our parents give us every day, or that those loved ones we live with provide us with. And this is one of the benefits of practice, is you begin to see what goodness allows us to be alive and thriving, what a bright garden we live in. So santuti, which is the word for contentment, could perhaps almost better be translated as appreciation. And it's important, this is a really beautiful practice, is before one goes to bed, taking time to recollect 5 gifts that were given to one in the day. And similarly, I was reading recently about a really wonderful organization. I believe they're called Dharma Gates, and I think their founder, or one of them, is here right now. And speaking about the level of discontent in college students right now, I think that 50% of college students or so have said they're deeply depressed, and 60% say that they suffer from intense anxiety. And for me, what this brings to mind, this level of discontent and hurt, is it's understandable when our society has left us bereft of purpose and of a canopy of meaning. So perhaps this is where our contentment truly comes from, is the alignment of our lives with some purpose that is greater than us. In Buddhism, the word is chanda, or zeal. And I've mentioned this before, but the movement towards a meaningful goal involves the dopamine system in the brain, whereas satiation involves the serotonin system, which is quickly satiated and quick to become hungry again. That's tanha, or thirst. But chanda, zeal, this dopaminergic drive towards a meaningful goal, that's where most of our pleasure in life comes from. So how can we align our lives with something that provides that level of meaning and can sustain us through the tragedy which inevitably comes? The next thought is, this Dhamma is for one who is reclusive, not for one who is entangled. And this is something we begin to experience more and more as we practice, is the social gatherings, the outings, the parties, even very wholesome gatherings become less attractive. And we become more and more okay with having time alone. And you see this in couples that have been practicing together for a long time, is they'll start to find time to spend in solitude. And it's something I see again and again, is people want so badly to find a way of bringing the Dhamma more into their lives. And I think one of the missing puzzle pieces so often is time for retreat. Stepping into these environments of monasteries or long-term retreat and really putting aside a week, honestly, if one can, several weeks a year, and making that a priority. And if that means foregoing the vacation to some city or something else, or taking a bit more time off work and losing a little pay, it's worth contemplating if that's a trade-off you're willing to make. Because there are places of practice where one can go and they're free. Abhayagiri, you can go spend weeks or months at if you'd like and pay nothing. Birkin, up in BC, Sarvasti Abbey is extremely affordable on the east side. And time and again, when one takes that opportunity to step out, it's the only time when one can gain a perspective on one's life. And I don't know how many times I've spoken with people who've taken that chance and that time, and immediately within about 2 or 3 days of stepping away, these enormous realizations and life shifts have had a chance to manifest. One friend was working a fairly standard post-collegiate job at a nonprofit at a desk and was miserable. And he didn't know it until he went to Deer Park, Thich Nhat Hanh's community in California. And within about 3 days, something had bubbled up in him where he realized that he needed to give it all up and take up carpentry. And he did. And as so often with those leaps into the unknown that are guided by that small voice of Dhamma, it ended up being the perfect thing. But unless we get distance from our lives, then it's almost impossible to see clearly those moments and those changes which need to be made. The next aspect is this Dhamma is for one who has their energy aroused, not for one who is lazy. This is, I think, one of the difficult parts about how practice has been taught in the West, is we've been given simple, basic, and lackluster instructions so often to, for example, bring the attention to one word, or the breath at the tip of the nose, or just don't do anything, even a teaching of non-doing. And the only means we have of drawing the mind when it's fairly activated to such a simple and neutral object is the will. And we can only put forth effort for so long before we lose energy for it. So a task, and the most important task in meditation, is to find a way to make it interesting and pleasurable. And this is why the recent breath techniques, such as the one I referenced in the guided meditation, which more and more scholars are pointing to as the real way the Buddha taught breath meditation in, say, the Anapanasati Sutta, mindfulness of breathing, with its 16 steps. I reference this sometimes, how when the Buddha asked the monks how they practice mindfulness of breathing, one said, Aritta, his name was, well, I put aside thoughts of the past and future, and then mindfully I breathe in, and mindfully I breathe out. And the Buddha kind of rolls his eyes and says, yes, Venerable Aritta, that is mindfulness of breathing, I don't deny it. But as to how mindfulness of breathing is practiced in full, listen and I will speak. And then he teaches the full 16 steps. And if we regain our acquaintance with the body, with how these breath energies flow through the meridians, with different places in the body where we can rest our awareness and feel certain resonances. For example, placing one's awareness around the tailbone with the breath can draw up a sense of nourishing, robust energy from the ground. Placing one's awareness up in the pineal gland at the center of the brain, when the awareness is bright and vibrant, can initiate a sensation of light. And when one does that, then awareness can suddenly drop to the heart, where it can rest silent for a time. And if one experiments with learning the landscape of the body, with playing with these breath energies and these applied perceptions, then meditation becomes interesting. Then you're not relying simply on a forced act of will to time and again draw the awareness back to its meditation object. But meditation is interesting and it's pleasurable. So if the meditation is not these things, then this is a good sign that one needs to apply a bit of creativity. And one of the difficulties with how traditional samadhi practice has been brought to the West is very simplistic techniques which allow no room for play or exploration. And it's a bit like giving a kid a wooden block to play with for an hour. It just doesn't go. And I know many practitioners who've been playing with wooden blocks for 20 or 30 years. And it's not a surprise that after a time, the practice stops progressing. The kilesas, the defilements, catch on. So, even certain teachings about non-doing, about just let what comes up, or a techniqueless technique, these are also kind of cop-outs at some level, because like Ajahn Jeff says, if you want to learn how this mind and its perceptions work, you play with it, you see how it reacts. Just looking at it is a bit like looking at eggs to try to understand eggs. This is Ajahn Jeff's metaphor. If you want to understand eggs, you make omelets, you break them, you make fried eggs, you make boiled eggs, you make French toast, you see how eggs interact. So we play in meditation. This is the proper approach. And then when the mind is quiet and there's pleasure flowing through the body, then things will settle. So effort is not an act of will. It can't be. I know many monks and many practitioners who ride the initial wave of faith for about 5 years. But unless you find a source of joy in the practice, it is not sustainable. And this practice is supposed to be pleasant. The Buddha says that the practice is good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end. This is a path of brightness and of joy. And that should be the flavor often. And one also has to acknowledge that the practice is tiered. Sometimes you will be able to sit, but other times the mind is active. And then it's useful to study suttas. You can channel your energies into practice if you conceive of practice as a broad landscape. So sometimes that will be listening to Dhamma talks rather than listening to music. Instead of going out with friends on a Saturday morning, you come and sit with friends, but friends of a different sort. And in doing this, we steadily grow in our practice to the point where it becomes a joy. And there's a quote I love by Rabindranath Tagore, where he says that, "I slept and dreamt that life was a joy. I woke and found that life was a duty. I acted, and behold, duty was a joy." And this is our path, is to acknowledge that life couched in the language of happiness and our own well-being, although this is the end goal, it's a language which isn't robust enough. The language of duty, of finding purpose, of understanding that our lives are a gift to us and a rare one, that we, having stumbled on the Dhamma, don't have the privilege or the luxury of turning away and of neglecting our hearts, because the world needs so badly people who are paying attention to that most important transcendent element in themselves. And the beauty of the Four Noble Truths, of mindfulness applied to every situation, is you realize that there's a thin thread of Dhamma running through every moment in your life, because intention is the core element. So whether it's encountering the unwashed dishes of your roommate and deciding whether to yell at them or wash them and kind of leave them passively aggressive in the drying rack and mention something later, or, and most of us know which one of those is right, but as we progress, the metric becomes less right and wrong and more beautiful and unbeautiful. So the real decision for most of us isn't those two. It's rather whether to wash those dishes, put them in the drying rack, and maybe make some offhanded comment, or maybe not. Or wash the dishes, dry them, put them away, say nothing. Can you do that? Because that is beautiful. And obviously, if your roommate is like some people I've lived with, you probably have to say something someday. But there's a time and place for that. And the point is that there is a jagged line running through every moment. And if we understand our lives as a vessel for this path, then even the most mundane and simple acts, even the most mundane suburban life, is not mundane at all. It is the most important thing we could possibly undertake. Because every moment is a chance to cultivate cetana, intention, towards the end of all suffering. And just because we live in a suburban, well-off environment, or not, does not mean that this path is any less needed. Depression rates in developed countries are, by some measures and surveys of the World Health Organization, 6 times those of many more tight-knit communities in developing nations. And this is not trying to romanticize poverty. I believe these studies were done in communities that had enough. But just to say that suburban American life can be soul-crushing. And just because we lose our purpose in slow, unseen ways does not make it any less tragic. So people around us need this path too. And by practicing and purifying the heart, we give them a true gift. And if we can remember that our lives are one movement towards that, that is a sustaining purpose and a source of energy. So I think that was 4 of 8, but we'll call it good for now. I think it's plenty. And it's important, I think, also to recollect that every one of those benefits from having a community. You see this in people trying to sustain a strong practice alone, is because they are alone, they have no choice in a sense but to crystallize their purpose and their boundaries in a somewhat strict way, in a way that pushes against and away from so much. But people who find a community to hold them, you can relax a little bit. You can soften and trust that the people around you will hold you on this path too. And in that comes real humility and real contentment. Okay, so I think we have a chance for some discussion and Q&A if people have the things they'd like to talk about. Does anyone know the time? I need to bring a watch. Okay, cool. So, yeah, would people have anything they'd like to ask about? Generally, we'll have another mic here, just today we don't. So people can ask me a question and I'll repeat it for everyone to hear, and we can all contribute as is desirable. Allison.
The fruits of karma, were they explicitly taught by the Buddha and set out in the sutras? For instance, if you did this or that wrong in the next life, you would be this or that. Was that taught explicitly by him, or was that something that came later in the commentary?
Yeah, I think, good question. So the question was, the fruits of karma, sort of the very clear fruits of, say, a bad action in another life or later in this life, was that sort of clear arithmetic taught by the Buddha? Or did it come later? This is something that I think for good reason we struggle with a bit, in that the Puritan trauma which our culture has suffered from, well, Puritanism and tradition held in a somewhat negative way leads to conceiving of merit and demerit as some sort of esoteric economy. I give this much, I get this much. I do this much bad, this sort of happens. And I think our hearts rebel against that naturally because, first of all, when we do good, it's so much more beautiful if we really just do it because it feels right. And indeed, in the hierarchy of reasons to give, the Buddha says that the lowest motivation of giving is, I give this for my own reward, whereas the next highest after that is, I give because it is good. So there's a clear acknowledgement that that motivation of the heart is better. And similarly, I think we would really appreciate the concept that we avoid doing evil just because we don't want to hurt people, not because we're afraid. And the Buddha also does speak about how the workings of karma are mysterious. He compares the fruit of a bad action to salt mixed with water. And many of you will know this analogy, where if one drops a pinch of salt into a glass of water, it turns the entire glass salty. whereas if one mixes a pinch of salt into the Ganges River, the taste hardly changes. And similarly, one who has a constricted mind, a small bad deed will echo in them and will bear enormous fruit, bad fruit. Whereas if one has developed the path, and specifically loving kindness, this broad heart, then even the fruits of bad deeds can manifest very briefly and very not all that bad. So these things are malleable, and yet action undertaken with intention always bears fruit, or always has the potential to. And there are certain flavors of those actions, and these are laid out very clearly in the suttas, actually. So there's a sutta called Vipaka Sutta, where the Buddha goes through what happens when one breaks the precepts. Killing, if undertaken, leads to rebirth in hell, in the animal realm, in the realm of hungry shades. At the very least, if one is reborn as a human being, the taking of life, when developed and pursued, leads to sickness and a short life. Stealing leads to loss of wealth. Sexual misconduct leads to revenge and rivalry. The 4 forms of wrong speech, these are interesting. Lying leads to being, I believe, falsely accused. Spreading divisive stories, gossip, leads to breaking of friendships. Idle chatter leads to one's words not being taken seriously. Coarse speech leads to unpleasant sounds. I've never known what that means. And then drinking and intoxication leads to muddled mindfulness. So yes, the fruits are there in the suttas.
So you gave a very abbreviated list. I'm going to get really specific now. One of the fruits that I've read of sexual misconduct is that you will be born female. Did the Buddha say that?
Oh, no, absolutely not. No, there's one of the places where there has been a lot of interpolation, most probably in the suttas, is there are certain suttas where the female gender is disparaged. And at least in quite a few of them, there's good reason to think that they were later interpolations. For example, and this is one of the benefits of recent comparative studies between the Pali Canon and the extant versions in the Chinese Agamas, which Bhante Analayo has spearheaded. So one of the really great fruits of that, for example, is there's a sutta in the Pali Canon where I think some bhikkhunis come to the Buddha and ask about if, basically the Buddha says there are these 5 qualities that women have that are very problematic on the path. In the comparative studies in the extant versions in Chinese tradition and in Sanskrit, I believe, the story actually is that one monk speaks about these 5 detrimental qualities. The Buddha is told about what he says, and he gives a talk to the bhikkhunis, speaking instead about how all women have, and all beings have the ability to awaken. So, yeah, and especially if one has encountered these teachings in certain cultural milieus, there is this thread, and it's deeply heartbreaking. Yeah.
Yeah, where could we find out more about the sutta that you used for the meditation this morning?
Yeah, so the question is, where can we find out more about the sutta that we spoke to in the meditation? That is Anguttara Nikaya 8.30. So that's the Book of the Eights of the Numbered Discourses, the 30th. And suttacentral.org is an amazing website. If you search up, oh gosh, it's hard. You could search Anuruddha Sutta, and I can write that down for you later. Or if you search AN space 8.30, AN stands for Anguttara Nikaya. So AN space 8.30. We actually did a whole winter retreat on that sutta up at Abhayagiri several years ago. So I think there's a series of winter retreat talks that are all based around that list. It's a great list. And the latter four are fascinating too. So, yeah. If one hasn't had a chance to read through the suttas, it's really worth doing. I mean, yeah, I know many teachers who recommend really going through the whole canon at least once, and one Ajahn I know says you should read through it at least 3 times before entering robes. Not that you're going to enter robes, but it couldn't hurt to read 3 times. So, Bhikkhu Bodhi has some great translations, but it's all free online at this point. So the question was, 2 weeks ago, I gave a talk about a sutta on how to deal with distracting thoughts. That's the Vitakka Santana Sutta, which is Majjhima Nikaya 20. So middle-length discourse is number 20. Yeah, and it's, so the different canons in the Pali canon have different, or the different Nikayas have different purposes, and the Majjhima Nikaya is the most accessible. The Digha Nikaya, the long-length discourses, it's kind of a wild ride. So a lot of devas and such. So I'd say Majjhima Nikaya is a good one, yeah.